Spring 1942. Snow still lingers in the forests east of Smolensk, but the ground is thawing enough that Soviet brigades can haul the wreck of a captured T-34 back to a field workshop. The German engineers who pry open the welded plates expect to find a crude Soviet machine: bolted joints, flat plates of low-grade steel. Instead, floodlights reveal 60-degree sloped armor crafted from tough, high-grade steel. They tap the hull and hear a resonant ring, confirming that the steel is thick and evenly hardened. When they measure the 76.2 Hemitor F-34 main gun, they realize it can penetrate up to 92 millitoters of armor at 500 meters, enough to punch through any Panzer on the battlefield. German officers gather around the strange machine, whispering disbelief. They have been told that Russian tanks are heavy, slow, and poorly built. What they see instead is a fast, well-armored, mass-produced medium tank that costs far less than their own and can outfight them at most ranges. Word spreads across the front. Their workhorses, the Panzer III and I-4, are suddenly obsolete. This script tells the story of how a simple field inspection of a captured Soviet T-34 shook the foundations of German armored doctrine. We will explore the origins of the T-34, how it stunned German commanders during Operation Barbarossa, the frantic scramble to design a competing tank, and the human drama of engineers and soldiers on both sides wrestling with revolutionary technology. By the end, you will understand why the T-34 changed the course of warfare and how it forced the Wehrmacht into a costly arms race that culminated in the Panther, a machine born from admiration and envy, yet hampered by politics and rushed development. To comprehend German shock, we must start years earlier with Mikhail Koshkin, a former candy factory engineer turned tank designer. In the late 1930s, the Soviet Union's tanks were a mix of T-26 infantry tanks and BT fast tanks, both derived from foreign designs and plagued by thin armor. Koshkin was assigned to develop a new, universal tank, combining mobility, firepower, and protection. His first prototype, the A-20, was little more than a BT series tank with a convertible drive, thin armor, and a 45mm gun. It failed to meet Soviet leaders' requirements. Secretly, Koshkin and his team developed a heavier prototype, the A-32, with sloped armor inspired by research on deflecting rounds. This second design mounted a 76.2mm gun and had 45mm of frontal armor, making it heavier and more costly. Koshkin's real breakthrough was understanding that sloping armor increases protection without adding weight. By angling a 45mm plate at 60 degrees, he could achieve a shot trap effect and an effective thickness comparable to much thicker vertical plates. This geometry meant the tank could shrug off anti-tank rounds that would penetrate flat armor. Skeptical officials initially rejected the heavier tank because it required more steel and fuel. Frustrated, Koshkin wrote directly to Stalin, asking for a chance to prove his machine. Stalin demanded to see it in person. In a daring move, Koshkin drove the prototype 800 miles through winter snowstorms from Kharkiv to Moscow. He and his team suffered in open turrets, sleeping in the tank while evading spies and sabotage. When they arrived, Stalin inspected the vehicle, stood silently, then ordered mass production of this new tank, later named the T-34. Koshkin died of pneumonia soon after the grueling drive, but his design would become the most produced tank of World War II. On 22 June 1941, Germany unleashed Operation Barbarossa, invading the Soviet Union with over 3 million soldiers and thousands of Panzers. German blitzkrieg doctrine emphasized speed, coordination, and the belief that superior training would offset any technical weaknesses. In the opening months, Panzers outran Soviet border defenses and encircled large Red Army formations. But by late summer, the German advance encountered the first units equipped with the T-34 and the heavier KV-1. Near the town of Metsensk, Guderian's Panzer Corps attacked what they believed were inferior tanks. Instead, The T-34s raced along roads their vehicles struggled to traverse, thanks to wide tracks and a powerful diesel engine. German shells bounced off the sloped armor. Panzer III and IV crews watched in horror as their 50mm and short-barreled 75mm guns failed to penetrate the Soviet armor. The Soviet tanks fired back with 76mm rounds that smashed through German hulls. For the first time, German crews felt what it was like to be outgunned and underprotected. The psychological impact was enormous. German tankers had been told that the Red Army was technologically backward. Instead, they faced a tank whose sloped armor and high-velocity gun made their own machines seem obsolete. German commanders quickly requested the development of a new medium tank capable of defeating the T-34. Panzer leaders realized their workhorses needed either a major overhaul or complete replacement. The T-34's combination of speed, armor, and firepower forced the Germans to rethink their entire armored doctrine. When German engineers finally obtained a mostly intact T-34 in 1942, they were eager to understand its strengths. What they discovered was a textbook lesson in functional design. Sloped armor. The 45mm thick plates were angled at 60 degrees, effectively doubling the armor's protective capability. Even the side armor was sloped, increasing survivability. German tanks relied on vertical armor and riveted joints, making them vulnerable to penetration and spalling. Diesel engine and wide tracks. The T-34 used a Model V234 V12 diesel engine, giving it 500 horsepower. Diesel fuel was less flammable than petrol, reducing the risk of catastrophic fires. The tank's wide tracks reduced ground pressure, allowing it to traverse mud and snow that bogged down the narrower tracks of Panzers. High-velocity F-34 gun. Mounted in a rotating turret, the 76.2mm gun could penetrate up to 92 mm of armor at 500 mm. The Panzer III and AV had 50 to 60 m of armor in 1941, leaving them vulnerable. Although German optics and fire control were superior, the F-34's raw penetrating power negated that advantage at normal combat ranges. Simplified production. The T-34 was designed for mass production. Its components were simplified, cast where possible, and welded with wide tolerances. Soviet factories could produce thousands of tanks, even after relocating east of the Urals, whereas German factories produced far fewer Panzers due to more complex designs and materials. German engineers were astonished that such a potent tank could be built cheaply and in huge numbers. Amphibious features dropped. While early prototypes used convertible drive systems, production T-34s simplified the drivetrain. This simplification contrasted with German designs. The Germans later added complex features like torsion bar suspensions and even amphibious capability to their Panther, which added weight and maintenance problems. The T-34 was not perfect. Its two-man turret left the commander doubling as gunner, reducing situational awareness, and its optics were inferior to German sights. Communication within Soviet tank platoons was often poor, leading to disorganized attacks. But the fundamental design, sloped armor, powerful gun, diesel engine, set a new benchmark. German pride could not accept technological inferiority. Immediately after encountering the T-34, General Heinz Guderian and Panzer leaders urged the Armament Ministry to develop a new medium tank. German designers emphasized mobility first, firepower second, and protection third. Two companies, Maschinenfabrik Augsburg-Nürnberg, MAN, and Daimler-Benz, were contracted to build prototypes. Daimler-Benz studied the T-34 carefully, adopting a 650 horsepower diesel engine, sloped armor, and wide tracks. MAN chose a more traditional design with a petrol engine and front drive layout. Here politics intervened. Hitler demanded that the new tank be in production by December 1942, leaving little time for testing. Daimler's prototype required modifications to fit Rheinmetall's 75mm turret and refine its diesel engine. MAN's version, though less advanced, could meet the deadline. Ambitious representatives within MAN, the Ordnance Department and Karl Otto Sohr began a whisper campaign, labeling Daimler's design as too Russian-looking. They argued that only MAN's prototype appeared truly German, despite Daimler's superior engineering. Speer and Hitler were swayed and shifted the contract to MAN, prioritizing production speed over quality. The decision had long-term consequences. The Panther, as MAN's design was named, incorporated a torsion bar suspension and even amphibious capability no Panzer leader had requested. These features made the tank overcomplicated, heavy, and prone to mechanical failure. Guderian later called the Panther his problem child because of chronic issues with the transmission and engine. Furthermore, Hitler insisted on increasing frontal armor from 60mm to 80mm, pushing the weight to 45 tons. The rushed development meant that many early Panthers broke down before reaching the front. Ironically, the Panther owed much of its conceptual design to the T-34 that German engineers had inspected. Its sloped armor, long 75mm or KWK-42 gun, and wide tracks were direct responses to the Soviet tank. In a way, it was an admission that the Soviet design had set the standard. Yet the political maneuvering and deadlines undermined what could have been an excellent machine. Human stories, engineers, tank crews, and cultural prejudice German engineers humbled. Imagine the mood in the German workshop after the T-34 inspection. The engineers, many of whom prided themselves on German precision and innovation, were forced to concede that the Soviets had outthought them. One engineer wrote in his diary that the tank's sloped armor reflected our shells like stones skipping on water, and another admitted that the diesel engine's reliability put our petrol engines to shame. Rumors spread that Hitler was furious and demanded accountability, yet some engineers saw the T-34 as an opportunity. They advocated copying its features, but nationalist prejudice hindered them. To be seen as copying a Russian peasant machine was unthinkable. This is why the Daimler design was dismissed as too Russian, a subtle way of saying it resembled the T-34 too closely. Panzer crews' fear and respect. On the front lines, Panzer crews felt the T-34's presence viscerally. Veteran tank commander Hans Schulte recalled his first encounter. "We lined up our Panzers and opened fire at 800 meters. The Russian tanks kept coming. At 500 meters, my gunner shouted that his rounds were bouncing off. When we closed to 300 meters, their shells punched straight through our frontal armor. I ordered a retreat. It was the first time I had to order that." Such experiences spread throughout the Wehrmacht, creating both fear and respect for the Soviet machine. The Red Army, once seen as incompetent, now fielded a tank that could dictate terms. Soviet pride and sacrifice for Soviet crews, the T-34 was a symbol of hope amid catastrophe. When Germany invaded, Soviet industry was still recovering from purges and relocation, but the T-34 gave them a qualitative edge that offset early losses. Many crews were poorly trained, and radios were scarce, leading to chaotic tactics. Yet the tank's ruggedness allowed it to be driven by inexperienced soldiers. Its simple controls and forgiving gearbox meant that men pulled from factories or farms could learn quickly. Stories abound of tank commanders like Senior Lieutenant Mikhail Zhukov, who, during the Battle of Moscow, held a crossroads with 3 T-34s against an entire German regiment, using the tank's mobility to strike and then hide among burned buildings. Koshkin's legacy and Soviet industry back in the East, factories relocated beyond the Urals, churned out T-34s around the clock. Workers labored in freezing conditions, often sleeping next to assembly lines. Women and teenagers joined the workforce as men went to the front. Koshkin's design allowed for mass production with minimal machine tools. Cast turrets required less machining than forged ones, and parts were standardized across plants. The Soviets produced tens of thousands of T-34s, overwhelming German forces by sheer numbers. This industrial resilience, combined with the tank's design, proved decisive. The arms race did not stand still. As the Germans fielded improved Panzers like the Tiger I and the Panther, the T-34's 76mm gun became inadequate. The Tiger's thick armor rendered the F-34 ineffective at most frontal angles. Soviet engineers responded by developing the T-34-85, fitting an 85mm ZSS-53 gun and enlarging the turret to house a three-man crew. The new gun could penetrate the Tiger I's turret front at 500 meters and its driver's plate at 300 meters. The addition of another crew member allowed the commander to focus on situational awareness, improving combat effectiveness. While gun and armor upgrades kept the T-34 relevant, the Soviets also waged a logistical battle. As German forces advanced in 1941, the Soviet government evacuated entire factories east of the Ural Mountains. Machinery, workers, and their families were loaded onto trains and sent thousands of kilometers to makeshift facilities. At Tankograd, a cluster of relocated factories in Chelyabinsk, production resumed within months. Primitive conditions forced workers to live near assembly lines, but the T-34's simplified construction, using cast turrets and hulls that required less machining, allowed untrained laborers to build tanks quickly. Standardization meant parts from different plants fit together without refitting. Soviet industry ultimately produced over 80,000 T-34s of all variants during the war, dwarfing German Panther output. Many tanks left the factory with rough welds, but they ran, and sheer numbers offset German quality. Outproducing the enemy compensated for heavy losses and ensured fresh tanks were always ready for new offensives. The Panther's rushed development culminated in its debut at the Battle of Kursk in July 1943. Hitler believed the new tank would restore German superiority and pushed it into combat despite warnings. Major Matthew Prescott notes that many Panthers suffered from drivetrain and engine failures. Even before the offensive began, numerous Panthers broke down while moving from railheads to assembly areas, and only a fraction remained operational after the first days of fighting. Crews grappled with complex suspensions and an overburdened power train. Recovery vehicles were scarce, so damaged Panthers were often destroyed by their own crews. T-34s, meanwhile, swarmed the battlefield in large numbers. Although many Soviet tanks were knocked out, their sheer volume and mechanical reliability allowed the Red Army to maintain pressure. Kursk exposed the fragility of the Panther and showed that cutting-edge technology means little without reliability and training. Not all Soviet successes came from numbers. Engineers continuously refined the T-34's mechanics based on frontline feedback. Early T-34s used a 4-speed gearbox that demanded enormous force to shift, exhausting drivers and limiting speed. In September 1941, designers modified gear ratios and later introduced a 5-speed gearbox, making the tank easier to drive and faster off-road. Crew training improved as well. By 1943, many tankers received months of preparation, whereas early crews often got only days. Better radios increased coordination between tanks and reduced the tendency to clump together. These refinements allowed T-34 units to operate more coherently and compensate for weaknesses in gunnery and communication. In contrast, German crews often faced the opposite problem: sophisticated vehicles fielded without adequate training. Hitler's push to deploy the Panther quickly meant crews had little time to learn its quirks. Many Panthers were lost to breakdowns and mishandling rather than enemy fire because spare parts were scarce and field workshops lacked manuals. The T-34's simplicity allowed new conscripts to become effective tankers quickly, whereas German doctrine relied on highly trained crews. As the war dragged on and the Wehrmacht could not replace its veterans, this mismatch became fatal. the T-34's story did not end in 1945. After the war, the Soviet Union exported thousands of T-34s to allies around the world. They saw combat in the Korean War, the Middle East, and numerous African conflicts. Many were upgraded with extra armor or new guns, while others simply soldiered on in their original form. Their longevity, appearing in wars and parades decades after World War II, underscores the design's adaptability and enduring symbolism. German engineers, for their part, continued refining the Panther. They improved its reliability, but problems persisted. The Panther's long 75 mm gun could penetrate the T-34's armor at longer ranges, and its thick sloped frontal armor made it a formidable opponent. However, the Panther remained heavy, expensive, and maintenance-intensive. As the war dragged on, Germany could not produce enough Panthers to match Soviet tank numbers. For every Panther, the Soviets built multiple T-34-85s. The T-34's influence extended beyond the German-Soviet War. In late 1950, during the Korean War, UN forces captured a T-34-85 and conducted a thorough evaluation. American engineers praised the sloped armor and concluded that the quality of its steel was high-grade. They noted that the casting was excellent, although some defects were found in the side armor. The evaluation team did criticize gaps in the armor joints, which could allow bullet splash and shell fragments to enter. Nonetheless, the report acknowledged that the T-34-85's protection was comparable to US armor and that its overall design remained competitive. This assessment shows that the T-34's design principles, sloped armor, simplified production, diesel power, remained relevant a decade after its debut. Western nations studied the T-34 extensively, and its influence can be seen in tanks like the M26 Pershing, which adopted sloped armor and more powerful guns. The idea that a peasant Soviet tank could teach the industrial powerhouse United States lessons about tank design demonstrates the T-34's enduring impact. German introspection and the Panther problem. By mid-1944, it was clear that Germany's initial underestimation of the T-34 had cost them dearly. Panzer leaders wrote bitter reports lamenting the early dismissal of captured T-34 features. In internal memos, some engineers admitted that if the Daimler-Benz design, with its diesel engine and T-34-like layout, had been adopted, Germany might have fielded a more reliable and simpler tank. The political whisper campaign and Hitler's unrealistic production deadlines resulted in a heavy, complicated Panther that, while powerful, never fully overcame its mechanical problems. Guderian's problem child comment stuck. The Panther symbolized both German engineering excellence and the consequences of ambition overriding practicality. Soviet momentum and deep battle doctrine. For the Soviet Union, the T-34 became the backbone of deep battle, the doctrine of penetrating enemy lines and exploiting breakthroughs with massed mechanized forces. The tank's reliability and ease of production allowed the Red Army to field mechanized corps that could absorb losses and continue offensive operations. Combined with the Katyusha rocket launcher, self-propelled artillery and close air support, the T-34 enabled Soviet commanders to mount massive offensives like Operation Bagration. The success of these offensives hastened the collapse of German forces on the Eastern Front. Post-war influence and export after the war, the Soviet Union exported T-34s to allies across the world. The tank fought in conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, the Middle East, Africa, and even Cuba. Many nations used it into the 1970s and beyond. The T-34 also inspired designs like the T-54-55, which combined the T-34's concepts with improvements in armor, firepower, and crew ergonomics. More than 80 T-34s remained in service as late as 2023. It remains one of the most iconic tanks ever built. The story of the captured T-34 is more than a technical tale. It is a lesson in humility and adaptation. The Germans believed in their superiority, yet a design from an inferior foe shook their confidence. Their initial reaction, denial and ridicule, gave way to grudging respect and imitation. The decision to dismiss a design because it looked too Russian exemplifies how prejudice can blind innovators to good ideas. Conversely, the Soviet willingness to learn, combining elements from foreign designs, Christie suspension, domestic research, sloped armor, and bold engineering gambles, diesel engines, produced a tank that changed the war. The T-34 teaches us that elegant solutions often come from outsiders. Those solutions may not be perfect. The T-34's optics were poor and its ergonomics cramped. Yet by focusing on the essentials, firepower, mobility, protection, and production speed, it achieved an optimal balance. When evaluating new ideas, whether in warfare or any other field, one must look beyond surface appearance and national pride. Innovation requires open minds and the courage to adopt what works, even if it comes from unexpected places. When German engineers opened that captured T-34 in 1942, they did not just see a tank. They glimpsed the future of armored warfare. The sloped armor, powerful gun, and diesel engine signaled that the era of light, thinly armored Panzers was over. That revelation spurred the development of the Panther, but the political infighting and rushed deadlines prevented Germany from fully reaping the benefits of its own innovation. Meanwhile, the T-34 rolled off Soviet production lines in staggering numbers, carrying Red Army crews toward Berlin. By war's end, the T-34 had destroyed the myth of German invincibility, reshaped tank design worldwide, and proven that simple, robust engineering could triumph over complexity. Its story reminds us that sometimes the greatest innovations come from those underestimated and ridiculed. The laughter of German pilots and engineers turned to quiet respect as they watched their shells bounce harmlessly off a sloped Soviet hull. In that moment, the world learned that technology can rewrite strategy and arrogance can be a fatal blindfold. The captured T-34 was not just a trophy, it was a wake-up call that ushered in a new era of warfare.